buenas tardes. Como vicerrector de investigación de la Universidad Católica de Valencia San Vicente Mártir, me complace darles a todos ustedes la bienvenida al webinar Desarrollo de competencias democráticas e interculturales en la formación del profesorado. Marcos de referencia de competencias para una cultura democrática, organizado por el nuevo Instituto Europeo de Educación para la Cultura Democrática de esta universidad. Tiene la palabra, para proceder a la presentación del Instituto, su directora y profesora de la Facultad de Magisterio y Ciencias de la Educación, la doctora Tamar Suali.
Buenas tardes a todos los asistentes. Es un placer recibiros hoy aquí en un evento tan especial para nosotros. Agradezco al vicerrector Francisco Arteaga que nos acompaña en este momento tan especial. También quisiera agradecer y extender mi reconocimiento al hecho que compartimos esa sesión con la funcionaria de la Comisión Europea, la señora Clara Centeno. Vamos a proceder para comenzar explicar el surgimiento del instituto y vamos a intentar contextuar un poco la charla en el hilo conductor que pretendemos fomentar a través de este instituto. El nacimiento de este instituto es un hecho único que viene determinado por un proceso de evolución desde la creación del grupo CIDEC, el grupo de investigación de la Universidad Católica de Valencia, Citizenship, Cultural Diversity and Education, que en el año 2017 empieza su andadura desde un planteamiento interdisciplinar y internacional. Sus primeras iniciativas se manifiestan en la creación de la Ibero-Mediterranean Research Network for Cultural Identity, Education and Public Policy. Entendíamos la necesidad de trabajar desde una sinergia, facilitar un diálogo entre la academia y los órganos decisorios. Tras 3 años de trabajo de investigación, jornadas, congresos internacionales y producción científica, este grupo embarca su camino en el proyecto Educational Needs of Teachers in the EU for Inclusive Education in Context of Diversity, conjuntamente con la Joint Research Center de la Comisión Europea. Fundamentalmente, el compromiso que asume el instituto, y ese es un texto que me gustaría resaltar, que está recogido de su carta fundacional, es fortalecer el proyecto europeo mediante la investigación, la formación, la transferencia de conocimientos basados en los derechos humanos, en la Carta Europea de Derechos Sociales y en el fomento de una sociedad más justa y culturalmente diversa. Desde este planteamiento, un planteamiento deliberativo, dialogante, el Ecudem pretende favorecer un diálogo científico, social, fundamentalmente intercultural e inclusivo, desde un planteamiento que está basado en la dignidad humana y en el reconocimiento de los derechos humanos como valores universales, excluyendo el relativismo cultural y pretendiendo favorecer una discusión de las ideas y respecto hacia el pluralismo y la diversidad. En nuestra trayectoria actualmente el Ecudem puede atribuir ciertos logros. El primero es una jornada científica internacional celebrada en el año 2007 conjuntamente con la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén. Hemos podido celebrar 2 congresos nacionales sobre educación intercultural y derechos humanos, uno auspiciado por el Ministerio de Educación, Cultura y Deporte de España. También hemos podido proporcionar publicaciones y transferencia de la investigación realizada tanto mediante un monográfico publicado en la revista de Educación del Ministerio de Educación de España sobre los entornos educativos y el sentido de competencia, el fomento del sentido de competencia a la comunidad desde un planteamiento de compromiso con valores democráticos. Hemos lanzado conjuntamente con la Joint Research Center de la Comisión Europea el primer volumen en serie de 4 de nuestro proyecto Innovation Educational Needs of Teachers in the EU for Inclusive Education in the Context of Diversity. El instituto tiene el lujo y el privilegio de contar con varios expertos procedentes de distintos ámbitos, todos enfocados, comprometidos con la diversidad cultural, los derechos humanos y la inclusión. De España tenemos miembros como, por ejemplo, el catedrático de Derecho Constitucional de la Universidad de Valencia, Antonio Barcendón, catedrático Jean Monnet. Tenemos al profesor catedrático Martyn Barret, profesor de Psicología de la Universidad de Surrey. Tenemos el profesor Casinader de la Universidad Monash de Australia. También tenemos desde la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén varios miembros que están haciendo con nosotros un camino consolidando nuestro proyecto de investigación, como el profesor Dr. Zvi Beckerman de la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén, el profesor Dr. Mauricio Dimant de la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén, la profesora doctora David Gross de la Universidad de Bar Ilan, y también tenemos el lujo de contar con la profesora Christine Slater de Estados Unidos, la profesora Claudia Lenz de Noruega, el profesor doctor Javier Valle de la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid y el profesor doctor Carlin Ross del Instituto Timisoara de Rumanía. Como bien podré entender, la prioridad y la orientación de este instituto es ofrecer una plataforma para un diálogo internacional fundamentalmente centrado en las prioridades de la Unión Europea, las necesidades educativas y en el diálogo. En el claustro de este instituto contamos con varios miembros, tanto de la Universidad Católica de Valencia como de universidades tales como la Universidad de Valencia, la Universidad de Alicante, la Universidad de Barcelona y la Universidad de Andorra. Y a nivel tenemos distintos colaboradores de distintas instituciones y de la Universidad Católica de Valencia. Y además tenemos un equipo técnico al que aprovecho la oportunidad y agradezco su maravillosa labor y su gran implicación, María Tanaskova Tasanova y Celia Martínez Córdoba. Las instituciones que en este momento han firmado un convenio de colaboración y que van a impulsar con nosotros todo el proceso del desarrollo de investigaciones y de transferencia en torno a las competencias democráticas y la visión, el fomento de los valores democráticos son, por ejemplo, la Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, la Universidad de Alicante, la Universidad de Barcelona, el Instituto Intercultural de Timisoara, la Universidad de Bar Ilan, la Universidad Hebrea de Jerusalén y el Instituto Wengeler que es una joint initiative, una iniciativa conjunta del Consejo de Europa y del Gobierno de Noruega. Muy brevemente me gustaría aprovechar esta oportunidad para trasladaros todo el interés que tenemos como instituto de poder contribuir mediante el diálogo y significativamente al fomento de la cultura democrática en nuestra sociedad. Decir que el instituto tiene su puerta abierta tanto para instituciones como investigadores procedentes de la Universidad Católica de Valencia como fuera de la Universidad Católica de Valencia. Nuestro instituto tiene un carácter inclusivo y su finalidad es favorecer y potenciar los valores democráticos, la cultura democrática y potenciar la capacidad del profesorado para abordar los retos que supone actualmente la diversidad cultural y el fomento del diálogo en una sociedad tan diversa, tan plural. Me gustaría terminar extendiéndome agradecimiento a varias referentes institucionales de la Universidad Católica de Valencia que han hecho posible la creación del instituto, empezando por el mismo vicerrector de investigación, Francisco Arteaga, y extendiendo mi agradecimiento también a todo el equipo de la oficina de la OTRI y su director, Guillermo Babé, y a dos vicerrectores muy especialmente que han apostado por la creación de este instituto, el vicerrector de Donación Académica, don Esteban, Luis y la vicerrectora de Relaciones Internacionales, Elena. Muchísimas gracias y pasamos al siguiente ponente.
Tiene la palabra la funcionaria del Centro Común de Investigación de la Comisión Europea y responsable del proyecto Inno4Div, doña Clara Centeno.
Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Agradezco primero a la audiencia que nos está escuchando todo lo que estamos compartiendo hoy, y también quería comenzar dando las gracias a la Universidad Católica de Valencia, San Vicente Mártir, en particular al vicerrector Francisco Arteaga y a la directora Tamar Suali por la invitación a presentar aquí este proyecto, que para nosotros es muy importante, y también dar la enhorabuena a ambos, a la universidad y a la directora nueva del nuevo Instituto Europeo para la Educación de la Competencia Democrática, que estamos seguros van a ser un gran contribuidor y va a dar un estímulo al desarrollo de estas competencias en Europa, que forman parte de valores clave que tenemos dentro de la Unión Europea. Voy a compartir unas transparencias, voy a presentar el proyecto Inno4DIF, avanzando que este proyecto ha sido financiado por la Comisión Europea y ha sido licitado, y la Universidad Católica de Valencia ha ganado la licitación, y es un proyecto que está actualmente en curso. El objetivo del proyecto, el proyecto trabaja en el ámbito de la formación de los profesores en la Unión Europea para una educación inclusiva en un contexto de diversidad. Personalmente trabajo en la unidad de Capital Humano y Empleo dentro del Centro Común de Investigación de la Comisión Europea. Os voy a contar un poco más quiénes somos. Voy a decir que la presentación la voy a realizar en castellano, y todas mis transparencias van a ser en inglés, así permitiendo un poco el bilingüismo de este evento. En primer lugar, 30 segundos de marketing de quiénes somos. El Centro Común de Investigación, o Joint Research Center en inglés, somos un servicio de la Comisión, un servicio de investigación, y nuestra misión es apoyar el desarrollo y la implementación de las políticas europeas de nuestros compañeros que están en Bruselas, aportando conocimiento científico para tal objetivo, investigación y consejo científico. Nosotros somos 3.000 personas distribuidos en 6 lugares en Europa, en España, Italia, Alemania, Bélgica y Holanda. En Sevilla, en España, en Sevilla, tenemos un centro que somos unas 400 personas. Nos focalizamos sobre trabajos que están relacionados con estudios socioeconómicos para el crecimiento y la innovación. Nuestra unidad, que trabaja sobre el capital humano y empleo, trabajamos principalmente para apoyar el desarrollo y la implementación de políticas de educación y de empleo. En esta unidad está ubicado el proyecto Inno4DIF que os voy a presentar. El contexto político de este proyecto Inno4DIF comienza ya en sus orígenes en el artículo 2 del Tratado de la Unión Europea. La Unión Europea está fundamentada en una serie de valores del respeto de la dignidad humana, la libertad, la democracia, la igualdad, el Estado de Derecho y el respeto de los derechos humanos, incluidos los derechos de las personas que pertenecen a minorías. Estos valores son, en principio, comunes a todos los Estados miembros, en una sociedad en la cual el pluralismo, la pluralidad, la no discriminación, la tolerancia, la justicia, la solidaridad y la igualdad entre hombres y mujeres prevalecen. Aunque estos valores forman parte de un fundamento de la Unión Europea, podemos decir que hasta ahora, o hasta hace recientemente, la Unión Europea no ha tenido un gran desarrollo político muy significativo, ha dado gran prioridad al desarrollo de estos valores entre sus ciudadanos. Sin embargo, en el 2015, debido a los desarrollos sociales que estamos viviendo, y en particular los atentados terroristas que tuvieron lugar en Europa, entre otros en París con el Charlie Hebdo, el ataque a la revista, los ministros de Educación se unieron para escribir una declaración de intención que se llama la Paris Declaration en el 2015 para establecer unos objetivos para trabajar hacia el desarrollo de los valores comunes de libertad, tolerancia y no discriminación a través de la educación. Esta declaración de París se ha convertido en una recomendación política en 2018 para promover los valores comunes, una educación inclusiva y la dimensión europea de la educación. Esta política, esta recomendación del Consejo, invita a los Estados miembros a promover la ciudadanía activa, para estimular actitudes tolerantes y democráticas, así como desarrollar competencias sociales, de ciudadanía e interculturales. Y además formar a todos los actores educacionales, profesores y formadores, para promover los valores comunes a través de educación inicial y formación continua. También acoge la intención de la Comisión Europea para desarrollar y revisar herramientas prácticas de referencia, así como documentos guía para los actores del terreno y apoyar con investigación para permitir desarrollo de conocimiento. En este contexto político es en el cual este proyecto se incluye. Además, estoy yendo a nivel cronológico, no por orden de importancia, la nueva comisión que está presidida por Ursula von der Leyen y que actúa desde septiembre de 2019 al 2024, ha establecido 6 guías políticas en las cuales incluye una de ellas un estímulo para el desarrollo de la democracia europea. Es decir, que nos estamos hoy en día ocupando de un tema que está realmente en las grandes prioridades de la Unión Europea en la actualidad.
Clara, ¿compartimos PowerPoint?
Perdón, me he olvidado de compartir. Gracias. Bien, el contexto, en nuestro instituto llevamos más de 10 años trabajando para el desarrollo de políticas de educación y tenemos una trayectoria de desarrollo de marcos de competencia, entre otras cosas, en la educación digital y la innovación en la educación. Recientemente, más ligado con este proyecto que estamos llevando a cabo, hemos publicado 2 informes sobre la innovación en el desarrollo de formación continua de los profesores. Y actualmente estamos llevando a cabo un proyecto transversal en el cual están participando una serie de unidades con el objetivo de comprender cómo los valores y el concepto de la identidad está evolucionando en Europa en un contexto de una sociedad multicultural. Este proyecto está explorando una serie de dimensiones, entre las cuales pues, cómo se forman los valores, la evolución de los valores, el impacto de la inmigración, la resiliencia, el contexto del desarrollo de los valores en un contexto digital, entre otros temas, y nuestra unidad contribuye con el rol de la educación, en el cual este proyecto se ubica. Entonces quisiera compartir la motivación para este proyecto Inno4Div dentro del ámbito de la formación de los profesores y las competencias de interculturalidad, que son la temática central del proyecto. En primer lugar, a pesar del impulso político, la investigación nos muestra que los profesores tienen dificultades para gestionar la diversidad en las clases, entre otras razones debido a la falta de competencias que tienen o preparación para realizarlo. En segundo lugar, la adquisición de la competencia intercultural es una necesidad crucial para los profesores para gestionar esta diversidad y poder ser eficaces en su labor educativa. Podemos definir la competencia intercultural como la habilidad para movilizar y desarrollar actitudes relevantes, habilidades, conocimiento y valores para interaccionar de manera efectiva y adecuada en situaciones diferentes interculturales. En tercer lugar, y en acuerdo con las encuestas que realiza la OCDE de los profesores, una encuesta que se llama TALIS, hemos encontrado que después de las competencias digitales, las competencias de interculturalidad son las más solicitadas a nivel de formación por los profesores. Y al mismo tiempo, a pesar de este contexto en el cual hay una necesidad importante y los profesores lo manifiestan, hemos constatado que hay una falta de formación efectiva en interculturalidad, tanto en la formación inicial como en la formación continua de los profesores. Entonces, esto nos ha llevado a definir un proyecto cuyos objetivos han sido esencialmente apoyar, desarrollar recomendaciones políticas para el desarrollo de las competencias interculturales de los profesores. Y más concretamente, hemos articulado estos objetivos. En primer lugar, confirmar el conocimiento que tenemos o que teníamos sobre los elementos clave que habilitan esta formación de los profesores y las barreras actuales que existen, que en cierto modo explican el por qué esta formación no está teniendo lugar. o no existe entre los profesores de manera suficiente. En segundo lugar, identificar y analizar una serie de buenas prácticas e innovativas, principalmente en la Unión Europea, que de manera efectiva abordan estas barreras. En tercer lugar, aprender de la práctica de estas buenas prácticas para elaborar recomendaciones políticas basadas en la eficiencia. Entonces, basados en estos objetivos, voy a presentar el plan del proyecto. En primer lugar, la primera fase se ha basado en una revisión sistemática de la literatura con dos objetivos. El primero es desarrollar un concepto de la interculturalidad que sería la base para el proyecto. Esto ha sido publicado en un informe, tal como ha presentado la doctora Tamaswali, que ha concluido con la elección del marco de referencia del Consejo de Europa, de Reference Framework of Competences for Democratic Culture, que tenemos el placer vamos a tener el placer de tener presentado por Martyn Barret. En segundo lugar, una revisión sistemática de aquellos elementos clave que habilitan la formación de los profesores, así como sus barreras. El informe está en fase de publicación, tendrá muy pronto público. Este conocimiento inicial era importante para identificar cuáles son las prácticas que queríamos elegir para poder observar, analizar de qué manera prácticas están innovando en el terreno, los actores están en el terreno, abordando las barreras, o sea, las cuestiones de la interculturalidad y cómo están materializando esos componentes clave que habilitan la formación de los profesores y, en cierto modo, solventando las barreras que aparecen. El análisis de estas prácticas está actualmente en progreso, muy avanzado, y esto nos va a llevar a lo que llamamos un cross-case analysis, un análisis a través de todas estas prácticas que nos permitirá aprender a través de las prácticas, identificar modelos de innovación y llegar a nuestro objetivo final, que son elaborar recomendaciones políticas desde la práctica hacia la política. El proyecto comenzó en octubre del 19 y se acabará en el segundo trimestre del 2021. Aquí presento de manera rápida la lista actual de los casos que estamos estudiando como buenas prácticas e innovadoras para alimentar y permitirnos elaborar las recomendaciones políticas. Las contribuciones que esperamos tener de este proyecto, en primer lugar y en línea con la misión de nuestro instituto de investigación, nuestro centro de investigación, es contribuir a la política, tanto al desarrollo como a la implementación. Concretamente, en el ámbito de las políticas de educación, a través del método abierto de coordinación. Debo señalar, para aquellos que están menos cercanos al ámbito de la política europea, la Unión Europea no tiene competencia legal en el ámbito de la educación, que está en manos las competencias de los Estados miembros o incluso las regiones, como es el caso de España. Y entonces el rol de la Comisión es un rol que se ubica dentro de este método abierto de coordinación, que da a la Comisión un rol de coordinación, aportar investigación, facilitar la comunicación entre los diferentes Estados miembros. Una de las herramientas de este método abierto de coordinación son los grupos de trabajo, entre los cuales los Estados miembros acuerdan trabajar en unos temas que consideran comunes, con problemáticas comunes, y en los cuales los Estados miembros consideran que el trabajar de manera colaborativa e intercambiando información puede ser enriquecedor y efectivo para resolver los problemas identificados. Los áreas de colaboración están definidos en el marco de Education and Training 2020 y puesto al día en el otro nuevo del 2030. Uno de los grupos de trabajo que existe en este marco es el grupo de trabajo que promueve para la promoción de los valores comunes y la educación inclusiva. Este grupo existía ya en los últimos años y su operatividad se ha confirmado recientemente tras la publicación de la nueva política del área educativa europea en septiembre. En segundo lugar, más recientemente, o tan recientemente como la política del área de educación europea, se ha publicado una política contra el racismo, un plan de acción contra el racismo, al cual esperamos también poder contribuir no solo con los casos, sino también con las recomendaciones a las que lleguemos a través de los análisis. Y también actualmente se está haciendo un trabajo preparatorio político para trabajar sobre la democracia, al que esperamos poder contribuir también. De manera no planeada, pero extremadamente bienvenida, ha sido el resultado de una colaboración del proyecto, la directora Tamasuali con Martyn Barret, el experto que tenemos hoy invitado, experto al Consejo de Europa. Ha sido una colaboración y una contribución de los resultados de este proyecto a los trabajos que está haciendo el Consejo de Europa precisamente respecto al desarrollo de las competencias democráticas y democráticas de los profesores dentro del marco de referencia de las competencias para la cultura democrática. Esto es el resultado también de la elección de este marco dentro del proyecto como el marco de referencia. Además de nuestras contribuciones a la política, es muy importante poder contribuir también a los múltiples actores que juegan roles diferentes en la educación y la formación de los profesores y que están realizando realmente el trabajo de terreno. Esperamos poder contribuir con la documentación y la diseminación de todas las prácticas documentadas a los diferentes actores en diferentes ámbitos, conferencias y a través de Internet, para que puedan beneficiarse de la inspiración que estas prácticas puedan aportarles como materiales de trabajo. Hasta aquí termino la presentación y les doy las gracias por su atención en esta presentación. Me excuso también por haber olvidado de haber compartido la presentación en las primeras transparencias. Supongo que estará disponible después.
Muchas gracias, Clara Centeno, por haber aceptado acompañarnos en este webinar. Muchas gracias, Tamar, por tu energía y esfuerzo que han permitido que estemos hoy aquí celebrando este evento. Muchas gracias a los compañeros de la Unidad de Cultura Científica de la OTRI y a los compañeros del Servicio de Nuevas Tecnologías de la Universidad Católica de Valencia, que nos han ofrecido las soluciones logísticas y tecnológicas para poder compartir este espacio, pese a estar situados en diferentes localizaciones. Es la magia de la tecnología y del trabajo bien hecho al servicio de la cultura, la educación y de la ciencia. Muchas gracias al ponente, el profesor Martyn Barret. Es un privilegio poder contar hoy con usted y le agradezco muy especialmente su disponibilidad. Finalmente, muchas gracias a todos los asistentes. Es un placer daros a todos la bienvenida al webinar Desarrollando competencias democráticas e interculturales en la formación del profesorado. Este seminario surge como resultado de una estrecha colaboración que se inició en octubre de 2019, ya se ha mencionado antes, entre la UCV y el Centro Común de Investigación de la Comisión Europea, la JRC, mediante un contrato de investigación para el estudio de las necesidades educativas del profesorado europeo para el desarrollo de una respuesta inclusiva en contextos de diversidad cultural. Para la Universidad Católica de Valencia, este proyecto, que nace y responde a las necesidades identificadas por la Comisión Europea, ofrece una oportunidad para realizar investigación. Desde el punto de vista del investigador, este tipo de estudio permite la transferencia directa de resultados, ya que estos mismos llegan a modo de recomendaciones a los órganos decisores europeos. Y además se publican mediante informes de la JRC, hemos visto alguno de ellos, y alguno que está pendiente de, próximo a ser publicado. Y de hecho, el primer informe fruto del estudio titulado Las competencias interculturales del profesorado acaba de ser publicado por la JRC. Para la UCV es una gran satisfacción poder contribuir a la investigación realizada por la JRC. Agradezco a Clara Centeno, investigadora senior y funcionaria responsable del proyecto Inno4D, en la JRC su participación y como conocedora del enfoque político de la Comisión Europea y experta investigadora de la JRC, que nos acercará a la visión de los órganos decisorios y nos ayudará a entender la utilidad del proyecto Inno4D. Gracias, Clara, por confiar en la UCV. También quiero dar la bienvenida al profesor Martyn Barret, experto internacional en el ámbito de las competencias democráticas e interculturales, con larga trayectoria como asesor del Consejo de Europa y de la OECD. El profesor Barret es uno de los principales autores del marco de referencia para el desarrollo de competencias para una cultura democrática del Consejo de Europa. Es un privilegio contar con el profesor Barret y escuchar de primera mano su visión sobre la formación del profesorado y el desarrollo de competencias para una cultura democrática. Por último, quiero destacar que este webinar es el primer evento que celebra el Instituto, el recién creado Instituto Europeo de Educación para una Cultura Democrática. Este instituto, dirigido por la doctora Swally, se ha creado recientemente en la UCV y me gustaría desearle, aprovechando la celebración de su primer evento, un futuro fructífero en el que todos sus miembros puedan crecer como investigadores y como personas. Ahora les dejo con lo más importante de este webinar, que es la intervención del doctor Martyn Barret. Doctora Swally, ¿puede presentar al ponente? Muy buenas tardes a todos.
Muchísimas gracias al doctor Francisco Arteaga, como siempre, por su disponibilidad, por su apoyo y también por su energía, que sin ella posiblemente esto no hubiera llegado a esta culminación. Me gustaría aprovechar este ratito al presentar al profesor Barret, también explicarles a ustedes la transformación en el sentido de cómo desde un planteamiento del desarrollo de competencias interculturales hemos acabado publicando realmente un marco conceptual sobre el desarrollo de competencias democráticas e interculturales. Ahí en realidad toda la obra, la producción, los ensayos de doctor Martyn Barret es fundamental. Explicar es que el Reference Framework of Competences for Democratic Culture, el marco de referencia para el desarrollo de competencias para una cultura democrática, es un marco de referencia que está promoviendo, es gestado y nacido por la colaboración entre diversos expertos que colaboran con el Consejo de Europa, Council of Europe. El profesor Martyn Barret es uno de los principales contribuidores, autores principales, y en este sentido el descubrimiento de su reflexión en torno al desarrollo de competencias interculturales y desarrollo de cultura democrática ha sido decisivo para el proyecto Innova4Div y por tomar esta orientación que hemos asumido. Clara Centeno ya nos compartió algunas pinceladas sobre la investigación y su justificación, ¿no? The rationale que está detrás. A mí me gustaría añadir simplemente este matiz sobre el por qué hemos acabado hablando de la necesidad de competencias democráticas interculturales. El ámbito de la educación intercultural es un ámbito que se está desarrollando desde diferentes disciplinas y fundamentalmente desde el ámbito de la pedagogía y la formación del profesorado en los últimos 30 años. Es un ámbito que en sus inicios nace desde el compromiso con un cambio social muy marcado por los movimientos de cambio, de reclamación, de reconocimiento de los derechos civiles en Estados Unidos en los siglos 80 y que se traslada, se traslada al continente europeo bajo otro paradigma que es el intercultural, donde se prevalece una visión que busca la inclusión, la incorporación, el reconocimiento de las minorías y de la diversidad cultural dentro del contexto de la Unión Europea como un factor enriquecedor. Como tal, el hecho es, como ha señalado Clara Centeno, que la Unión Europea actualmente goza de una presencia de diversidad que además está reconocida políticamente e institucionalmente en los diferentes Estados miembros. Cuando nosotros tenemos que responder al reto de identificar aquellos componentes que favorecen el desarrollo en la formación del profesorado de la capacidad de las competencias interculturales, estamos empezando estudiar y analizar multitudes de publicaciones de mayor relevancia en el ámbito tanto sobre la interculturalidad en su contexto político y social, como sobre la educación intercultural y, por supuesto, aquello que tiene que ver con la participación y la inclusión social, con la idea de poder ofrecer un marco conceptual consolidado que recoge diferentes aportaciones disciplinarias y que su finalidad es elaborar una serie de recomendaciones que van a favorecer la inclusión y la participación de personas, de diferentes personas, comunidades que pertenecen a la diversidad cultural que actualmente nos caracterizan. Tras un estudio a fondo de los diferentes planteamientos y de los marcos, nosotros llegamos a la conclusión que realmente hablar de una competencia intercultural o competencias intercultural es una aproximación bastante reducida, bastante limitada, porque la propia interculturalidad como una visión social y como un proyecto político realmente es una continuación natural de nuestro proyecto político democrático. Y por lo tanto, la competencia intercultural forma parte de un conjunto de clúster de competencias que lo que vienen es proporcionar a los miembros de las sociedades democráticas desenvolverse planteando interacción basada en valores de diálogo, de comunicación, de reconocimiento y de derechos humanos. Tras haber hecho este recorrido, hemos conocido el planteamiento que recoge el Rfcdc, el Reference Framework of Competences for Democratic Culture, y nos dimos cuenta que hay un buen trabajo realizado con rigor científico, con un desarrollo empírico y con un enfoque inclusivo pedagógico que ya nos permite plantear la posibilidad de diseñar una serie de recomendaciones que se podrán posteriormente incorporar a nivel institucional en la formación de profesorado. Por lo tanto, nuestro diálogo científico con el doctor Martyn Barret viene a raíz de este diálogo previo empírico y el intercambio de conocimientos que vienen realmente a realzar lo que puede aportar el marco de referencia para el desarrollo de competencias democráticas a la formación de profesorado y muy concretamente también a la formación del alumnado universitario. No me gustaría alargar más, me gustaría dejaros ya con la presentación del doctor Martyn Barret. El currículum del profesor Martyn Barret es muy extenso, sería necesario todo un webinar dedicado a su currículum, pero podría decir algunas pinceladas. Es catedrático emérito de la Universidad de Surrey, se ha dedicado toda su vida a estudiar y a formar educadores, psicólogos y otros actores en el ámbito social, pedagógico y psicológico para el desarrollo de competencias interculturales y democráticas. Es uno de los principales autores de los últimos informes PISA sobre el desarrollo de la competencia global y es el autor principal en el informe del Council of Europe, el Reference Framework of Competences for Democratic Culture. Os dejo con mucho gusto con la intervención del doctor Martyn Barret y espero que podamos luego seguir este diálogo.
Okay, hello everybody. It's my very great pleasure to be here with you today. I'd like to thank Tamar Shuali and the University of Valencia for inviting me to make this presentation. I'm going to be talking about the Council of Europe's Reference Framework of Competences for Democratic Culture. And what I'm going to attempt to do is to provide you with an introduction and a general overview of the entire reference framework. The reference framework is actually hugely ambitious, and the reason for this is the framework aims to provide a single comprehensive approach covering education for democratic citizenship, human rights education, and intercultural education all together. In addition, the reference framework, it's also aimed at the full range of formal education. In other words, we're aiming it at the entire educational system that runs all the way from preschool through primary and secondary education up to university level education. And what the framework does, it offers a range of very detailed proposals on how formal education can be used to equip young people with the competencies needed for participating actively in democratic culture, for respecting, promoting, and defending human rights, and for participating in effective and appropriate intercultural dialogue. So there is a lot here in this framework. Now, before I begin to describe the framework itself, it's very important for you to be aware of two important background assumptions to the reference framework. The first of these background assumptions concerns the term democratic culture, which appears in the title of the framework. Now, we use this term because obviously democracy cannot exist without democratic institutions. You have to have things like universal voting rights, free and fair parliamentary elections, rule of law, an independent judiciary, and so on, if you're having a democracy, a democratic system to govern your country. However, these democratic institutions in and of themselves will not work in practice unless citizens themselves hold democratic values and attitudes and are willing to engage in democratic practices. Now, what we mean by that in practice is we think a functioning democracy requires citizens to have, first of all, a commitment to using the democratic processes that are available to them, a willingness to express their own opinions. They have to have a willingness to listen to the opinions of other people. They have to have a commitment to decisions being made by majorities, and they have to have a commitment to the protection of minorities and their rights. And finally, they must have the conviction that conflicts must be resolved peacefully. This is what we mean by a democratic culture, where citizens have all of these commitments and willingnesses to engage in these various things. The second background assumption concerns intercultural dialogue. We claim that in a democratic culture, in culturally diverse societies, you have to have intercultural dialogue. Now, the reason for this is because a fundamental principle of democracy is that the people who are affected by political decisions should be able to express their views when those decisions are being made, and that decision makers should then pay attention to those views when they are making their decisions. Intercultural dialogue is precisely the way in which citizens can communicate their views, their needs, their concerns to other people who have different cultural affiliations from themselves. So this means in the case of a culturally diverse society, intercultural dialogue is absolutely vital for democratic discussion and debate, and for enabling all citizens to contribute to political decision-making on an equal footing, irrespective of their specific cultural affiliations. So in other words, we are viewing intercultural dialogue as being crucial for democratic culture and for enabling democracy to function properly. Now, the reference framework, now we'll start to get into the substance of the framework. It was published in 3 volumes in 2018 by the Council of Europe. These are the 3 volumes. And what I will do is talk you through each of these 3 volumes in turn. Now, the first volume describes a conceptual model of the competencies that young people need to acquire if they are to participate effectively in democratic culture and in intercultural dialogue. The second volume provides lists of what are called scale descriptors for all of the competencies that are contained in the conceptual model. I'll come back to this concept of scale descriptors later on and explain what that actually means. And then the third volume of the reference framework provides guidance for ministries of education and for education practitioners on how the model and the descriptors can be used to inform educational policy and practice in 6 main areas. The first area is curriculum development. The second is pedagogical planning. The third is assessment practices. The fourth is the use of a whole school approach in schools. The fifth is teacher education and training. And the sixth area is how education can be used for combating radicalization. So what I'm going to do is talk you through each of these 3 volumes of the reference framework in turn. So I'll start with the first volume, which describes the conceptual model of competences. Now, the conceptual model, essentially what it does, it provides a detailed description of the competencies that people require if they are to participate effectively in democratic culture and intercultural dialogue. These are the competencies, in other words, that education needs to help young people to acquire if they're going to function as effective democratic citizens, if they're going to respect human rights, and if they're going to engage in intercultural dialogue. Now, the process of developing this model, which lies at the heart of the reference framework, it was a long process, which actually took 2 years altogether. And the process involved the following stages. We began by basically auditing all of the conceptual schemes of both democratic competence and intercultural competence that we could find in the literature. And altogether, we identified 101 different conceptual schemes that are out there already. So we audited these 101 schemes. We analysed those schemes to identify the constituent competencies which those schemes contained. And we then used a set of principled criteria to identify the core competencies that are contained across those 101 schemes. Having done that, we produced a first draft of the conceptual model of these core competencies that we had identified. And that first draft was then sent out in an international consultation. The document was sent to academic experts, to education practitioners, education policymakers, and to experts who'd been nominated by the education ministries of the member states. And the end result was the model received very strong endorsement in this consultation. But obviously, we received some very useful feedback also in the consultation. So we used that feedback from the consultation to do some final fine-tuning of the model in order to end up with the model that you'll now find published in the reference framework. The model specifies 20 core competencies altogether. These are the competencies that we think young people need to acquire if they're going to function as effective democratic citizens and if they're to engage in intercultural dialogue. All 20 competencies are teachable, learnable, and accessible. That was crucial when we were developing the model to identify these sorts of competencies. And the 20 competencies in the model, they fall into 4 broad categories. The first group of competencies consist of values. The second group consists of attitudes. The third set of competencies are skills that are needed. And the fourth category is knowledge and critical understanding, the knowledge and critical understanding that people need in order to be democratic citizens and if they're going to engage in intercultural dialogue. Now, this slide is a diagrammatic summary of the model. These are the 20 competencies subdivided into values, attitudes, skills, and knowledge and critical understanding on this screen. And as you can see, there are 3 sets of values, 6 sets of attitudes, 8 sets of skills, and 3 bodies of knowledge and critical understanding. Now, in a short presentation such as this one, I haven't got time to go into the details of all of these, But if you look at volume 1 of the reference framework, you will find all 20 competencies described in considerable detail and broken down into exactly what we mean by each one of these competencies. So, for example, you'll find a detailed specification of what we mean by valuing cultural diversity, what we mean by civic-mindedness, what we mean by cooperation skills, or what we mean by knowledge and critical understanding of language and communication, for example. So if you want to find out more about these 20 competencies, do please take a look at volume 1 of the reference framework. So the model basically proposes there are these 20 component competencies which go together to make up, if you like, democratic and intercultural competence, which is what is shown in the center of this slide. Now, the model also talks about how an individual person will mobilize and deploy these competencies. And what we actually propose is that if you're confronted with a real life situation, these competencies are very unlikely to be mobilized and to be used individually. Instead, we think they're much more likely to be applied in clusters. So depending on the situation which an individual is confronting, the specific demands, challenges, and opportunities of that situation, as well as the specific needs of the individual within that situation, then that individual will have to activate and use different subsets of competencies. Furthermore, individual situations, they're not static, they're dynamic, they change over time. So for this reason, if you're going to produce an effective and an adaptive response to that situation, you have to constantly monitor the situation and you have to adjust the competencies that you're using in an appropriate manner as the situation progresses. In other words, we propose that a competent individual will mobilize and deploy clusters of competencies in a fluid, dynamic, and adaptive manner in order to meet the constantly shifting demands, challenges, and opportunities that arise in democratic and intercultural situations. Okay, let's move on to the second volume of the reference framework. This second volume provides lists of descriptors for these 20 competencies. So the descriptors, we provide descriptors for all 20 competencies that appear in the model. Now, what we mean by a descriptor is this. A descriptor, it's a statement or description of what a person is able to do if they have mastered a particular competence to a particular level. In other words, these descriptors provide examples of the concrete observable behaviors which a person will display if they have achieved a certain level of a given competence. Now, the descriptors in the framework have all been formulated using the language of learning outcomes. In other words, each descriptor contains an action verb and the object of that verb, and the behavior that's described by the descriptor is both observable and assessable. Now, because they're learning outcomes, these descriptors can therefore be used for purposes of curriculum development, for pedagogical planning, and for assessment purposes. I'll say a little more about that as we go on. Now, the descriptors also took a long time to develop. A lot of empirical work went into the process. We began by auditing existing scales, research documents, policy documents, and altogether we audited 98 documents. And what we basically did, we extracted scale items and statements that we found in those documents to construct short statements that could potentially serve as descriptors for the framework. And initially, when we're starting out, we wrote over 2,000 descriptors in total. We then evaluated those descriptors that we had written, and we used a series of rating tasks, validation tasks, and scaling tasks. And it was teachers who participated in these tasks, rating and validating and scaling the descriptors. And altogether, over 3,000 teachers from across the whole of Europe participated in this activity. And the data that we obtained through this process, we identified out of those 2,085 descriptors, we identified 447 descriptors which were very highly rated by the teachers and were validated through the various tasks that we used. And out of this large set of 447 descriptors, we identified a smaller set of 135 key descriptors to cover all 20 competencies. And the data, in addition, from the teachers was used to scale the 447 descriptors to 3 different levels of proficiency, to either a basic level, an intermediate level, or an advanced level. Now, this might seem a little abstract to you as I state it like that, but let me give you some concrete examples. Here are the scaled key descriptors for the competence of skills of listening and observing. The work that we did showed that at the basic level of proficiency, this competence was indexed by 2 behaviors in particular: when the individual listens attentively to other people and when the individual listens carefully to differing opinions. These were found to fall at the basic level of proficiency. The scaling procedure that we used identified also an intermediate level of proficiency for this particular competence, exemplified by these 2 descriptors: can listen effectively in order to decipher another person's meanings and intentions, and watches speakers, gestures, and general body language to help himself, herself, to figure out the meaning of what they're saying. Now, you can see by looking at those 4 descriptors together that the 3rd and 4th one, they are more advanced than the 2 at the basic level. You now see that the 2 at the basic level are fairly basic, listens attentively and listens carefully. Whereas now we're looking at going beyond, if you like, the actual just what people say, and actually deciphering meanings and intentions and looking at body language. Now, at the advanced level of proficiency, even more advanced behavior is exhibited, pays attention to what other people imply but do not say, came out as an advanced level of proficiency indicator. And likewise, when an individual notices how people with other cultural affiliations react in different ways to the same situation, that also is an advanced level of proficiency. And there again, you can see that the descriptors at the advanced level, they are more advanced. They're more proficient behaviors than at the intermediate, than the behaviors at the basic level as well. So you can see how the descriptors are cumulative as you go across these 3 levels. Let me give you one more example. One of the other competencies in the framework is civic mindedness. So at the basic level of proficiency, we found that expresses a willingness to cooperate and work with others and collaborates with other people for common interest causes. They came out at the basic level of proficiency in the teacher's judgments. The intermediate level of proficiency are these 2. These are 2 examples of the intermediate proficiency level: expresses commitment to not being a bystander when the dignity and rights of others are violated, and discusses what can be done to help make the community a better place. Again, you can see that these are a higher level of proficiency than the 2 behaviors that are at the basic level of proficiency. So there is increasingly proficient behavior here. However, there's also an advanced level of proficiency, and a descriptor that came out at the advanced level was exercises the obligations and responsibilities of active citizenship at either the local, national or global level. So this is really being an active citizen. Another descriptor that came out at the advanced level was takes action to stay informed about civic issues. Now, this is an interesting case where you really do need data, I think, from teachers in order to scale these descriptors. When we originally wrote these descriptors, I thought this one would come out at a lower level of proficiency. Being, making sure that you're informed about civic issues seems like a fairly basic sort of thing that an individual citizen could do. But actually, it came out through the empirical work with the teachers that this actually falls at the advanced level of proficiency. It's more complex than, for example, the behaviors at the intermediate level of proficiency. So those are two examples of the scaled key descriptors that are contained in the reference framework. Now, an important point to note about these descriptors is that the scaling, it doesn't mean that once a person has achieved a certain level of proficiency, they can only increase their proficiency level still further. It's always possible that regressions can occur. For example, this might happen as a result of a change in the social environment for the individual. It could happen because there's a shift in the political climate of a country, an encounter with someone from a previously unknown cultural background. You could have a regression, or you can have a regression because of an unpleasant or traumatic personal experience, for example. Now, if this happens, learners may require additional support for returning back to the higher level of proficiency if regressions do take place. In addition, a really important point to notice is you can have a learner who can be at different levels of proficiency on different competencies. If a learner, for example, is at an advanced level of proficiency on, for example, empathy, this does not mean that they're at an advanced level of proficiency on the other 19 competencies. Instead, they might, for example, only be at a basic level of proficiency on, for example, valuing human dignity and human rights, or on self-efficacy, for example. Empathy is not necessarily correlated with or tied to the same level of proficiency on other competencies. And that's important, and a very important point to take on board. Now, a key point to understand about the descriptors is they effectively provide an operationalization of the 20 competencies in terms of the concrete behaviors that might be displayed by learners at different levels of proficiency. This is the key point about the descriptions. They are an operationalization of the competencies. And these descriptors, as I said before, they can be used for many purposes. For example, you can use them to develop a curriculum, and in that curriculum, you might not only want to specify the competencies that should be targeted at particular educational levels. Using the descriptors, you can also describe the specific learning outcomes that you want learners to achieve at each individual level. So you can use the descriptors to help write a curriculum. You can also use the descriptors as a toolbox for designing and evaluating learning activities that are aimed at enhancing learners' competencies. So the descriptors, because they're formulated using the language of learning outcomes, you can use the descriptors to specify the expected learning outcomes for those activities. And finally, of course, you can use the descriptors to support the assessment of a learner's level of proficiency. And this can be done either to identify areas for further development, informative assessment. So, for example, if you identify that a learner is at a basic level on one particular competence, you might want to basically then think about designing further learning activities that will help to advance that learner to an intermediate level of proficiency. So assessing a learner and finding that they're at a basic level in order to work out where you should take that learner next. That would be using assessment for a formative purpose, or of course you can use the descriptors to support the assessment of proficiency after a period of learning has taken place. In other words, for summative assessment purposes. Right, so the third volume of the reference framework provides guidance on how the reference framework can be implemented in practice. There are 6 guidance chapters in volume 3, and they explain how the competence model and the descriptors can be implemented in formal education. And these chapters, again, as I said earlier, they cover 6 topics altogether. The first chapter talks about how you can use the framework for the purposes of curriculum development. The second chapter talks about the pedagogical methods that are most appropriate for the teaching and learning of the 20 competencies. The third chapter talks about and explains in detail how the framework can be used for assessing learners. The fourth chapter talks about how to apply the framework using a whole school approach in order to foster the development of the 20 competencies. The fifth chapter is about teacher education and how teacher education needs to be adapted in order to support the use of the framework in national education systems. And the 6th chapter explains how the framework can be used to combat radicalization leading to violent extremism and terrorism. So the 6 chapters, they adopt a particular approach. They are guidance chapters. They try not to be overly prescriptive. Now, the reason for this is the following. Now, citizenship education, we know that it's already a part of the curriculum in most countries. And for this reason, implementing the reference framework in an education system, it doesn't impose an entirely new set of duties on education policymakers and practitioners. Instead, we intend the framework to be a tool that's there to assist and help policymakers and practitioners to rethink their existing activities. Now, the available research evidence actually suggests that education based on the reference framework will be most effective if it's delivered using a cross-curricular and a whole school approach. I'll say more about what those 2 things mean in a moment. But the guidance chapters in themselves are actually very open-ended. If you take a look at chapter 3, you'll find that what they actually do, involve the chapters in volume 3, they aim to outline the various options and possibilities that may be used to implement the reference framework, and they state the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages of the different options and possibilities. But we deliberately have left all decision making about which options should actually be used in implementation to local policymakers and practitioners, because they are the people who have the detailed understanding of the national and local context in which they are operating. So we're not attempting to impose a set of prescriptions from the centre upon the whole of Europe. Rather, here is a set of recommendations, guidelines, suggestions, options, possibilities, and it's up to the local users to actually make their choices on how to implement the framework in a way that's suitable for them and their educational contexts. So very quickly, I'll just run through the 6 chapters and say a little more about each one of them. The chapter on curriculum, which starts volume 3, it starts off by discussing the principles of curriculum design. So it talks about things like, for example, horizontal and vertical coherence in the curriculum, the need for progression in the curriculum, the relevance of the curriculum for learners, transparency in the curriculum, and avoiding curriculum overload. These sorts of principles that curriculum designers always take into account, or always should take into account, when they're developing a new curriculum. In addition, this chapter on curriculum, it explains how the framework, and by that I mean both the model of competences and the descriptors, can be used for, first of all, auditing and reviewing the prescribed curriculum which currently exists that a school is using, to identify where democratic and intercultural competencies may be targeted as suitable learning outcomes. So for purposes of auditing and reviewing the existing curriculum, but it can also be used for developing that curriculum. For example, if you find that the existing curriculum only covers or allows coverage of perhaps 10 of the competencies, you might be able to develop the current curriculum to ensure that all 20 competencies are fostered in learners instead. The chapter also talks about how to develop a cross-curricular approach. Now, this is a key feature of the reference framework. We think that the implementation of the reference framework will be most satisfactory if it's implemented in a cross-curricular manner. And what we mean by that is the responsibility for fostering democratic competencies in learners is distributed and incorporated across the entire school curriculum in an appropriate manner. So, for example, this isn't just a matter for teachers of civic education or teachers in social studies to do. We think that the reference framework can actually, the competencies in the reference framework can actually be targeted, for example, even in the natural sciences and in mathematics as well. For example, in mathematics, you might set up a group project which relies upon cooperative principles, learning principles, and learners have to cooperate with each other. They have to listen to each other, use their listening and observing skills. They have to communicate with each other using their linguistic skills. They have to think about materials, use analytical and critical thinking skills, and so on. So even in a mathematics project, you can be targeting some of these competencies. So this is what we mean by a cross-curricular approach, an approach where every single school subject is harnessed, if you like, to foster these competencies in learners. So the second chapter, guidance chapter, is on pedagogy. This chapter also starts off by discussing the principles, in this case of pedagogical planning. So it talks about the role of experience and the role of comparison, analysis, reflection, and action in teaching and learning. And then this chapter reviews the wide range of teaching and learning methods that are suitable for fostering the development of democratic and intercultural competencies in learners. And these mean or include, first of all, teachers need to model democratic and attitudes and behaviors in their own behavior, the way that they interact with students in their class. They need to implement democratic processes in the classroom as well. And then specific pedagogies that can be used are cooperative learning, project-based learning, and service learning. We think these are three pedagogies that are particularly suitable for teaching and learning of the 20 competencies. And you'll find the explanations of why we think they're suitable in this chapter on pedagogy. The third chapter is the chapter on assessment. And again, this starts off by talking about principles, the principles of assessment. So things like validity, reliability, equity, transparency, practicality, and respectfulness in assessment. And the chapter also discusses various distinctions, for example, between formative versus summative assessment, the distinction between high stakes versus low stakes assessment, and so on. There are a whole set of distinctions that the chapter discusses. And then this chapter reviews the wide range of assessment methods that are most suitable for fostering the development of the 20 competencies in learners. And these include, for example, using open-ended diaries, reflective journals, or structured autobiographical reflections as the basis for assessments. You can use observational assessment. You can use dynamic assessment. There's project-based assessment. And perhaps the gold standard, the best form of assessment we think that's ideal for use in relationship to the reference framework is portfolio-based assessment. So all of these are described and explained in the chapter on assessment. The chapter on the whole school approach is the 4th chapter. This chapter explains what a whole school approach is, and it explains how schools can implement this kind of approach. And essentially what we mean by whole school approach is using democratically and interculturally appropriate and respectful structures and procedures in all aspects of school life. So that means using democratically and interculturally appropriate and respectful structures and procedures in curriculum development. It should be used in the teaching and learning methods and resources that are actually used in the classroom, in the assessment methods that are used. So these are things that are talked about in those first 3 chapters. But also, if you're using a whole school approach, you should also have these sorts of structures and procedures in school leadership. School leadership should be conducted according to these structures and procedures. Governance and decision-making within the school should also be using these principles. The relationships between members of staff, between staff and students, and between students themselves within the school should also basically be democratically and interculturally appropriate and respectful. Extracurricular activities that are run by the school should also use these principles, and links between the school and the community should also follow these principles. So it's every single aspect of the school should be permeated by these sorts of principles, structures, and procedures. This is what we mean by whole school approach. And there's very good evidence that using that kind of approach is actually the ideal method to foster many of the competencies in learners. Right, the 5th chapter is then on teacher education, and this chapter discusses the role of both pre-service teacher education and in-service teacher education in promoting and implementing education based on the reference framework. And the chapter suggests that because education based on the reference framework is most effective when it's delivered using a cross-curricular and a whole school approach, the responsibility for delivering that education should not be assigned solely to subject-specific specialists, for example, teachers of civic education or social studies. Instead, that responsibility should actually be shared by all teachers in the school. So for this reason, the chapter argues teacher education really should ensure that all teachers should understand the principles of the reference framework and are proficient in applying those principles in the course of their everyday planning and practice. Teacher education also has a responsibility to ensure that all future and practicing teachers are given the opportunity to develop their own democratic and intercultural competencies as well. And this applies not only to, if you like, student teachers, but also to the teacher educators, the people who are training the teachers. These are all points that are made in this chapter on teacher education. Right, the final guidance chapter in volume 3 is about radicalization leading to violent extremism and terrorism. And this chapter, it's been included in the guidance because both the Council of Europe and the ministers of education in the member states have recognized the relevance of the reference framework for combating radicalization. And there's now a widespread political expectation that the reference framework will be used by national education systems, yes, to equip young people with the competences that they need for democratic culture and intercultural dialogue, but also with the competencies that they need, for example, to recognize and to deal with online radicalizing propaganda. And the most pertinent competence here is analytical and critical thinking skills. If you have those skills and you're confronted with this propaganda, you should be able to deconstruct that propaganda and see it for what it is. Second of all, if you're equipped with these competencies, you should be able to recognize and respond to hate speech in the news media and online. So, for example, one of the competencies, knowledge and critical understanding of media. You will be equipped with that competence. And so you should be able to identify hate speech when you encounter it. And you should also be equipped with the competencies of valuing human dignity, valuing human rights, and valuing democratic processes. So the chapter on radicalization explains in detail why and how the reference framework is relevant to building resilience to radicalization. This is by building young people's democratic and intercultural competencies. This will build learners' resilience to radicalization. So there is an implicit philosophy underlying the reference framework, which I hope you're beginning to pick up on here during the course of this presentation. But these, I think, are the key messages which I would like you to take away from this presentation. This implicit philosophy is basically saying, right, the competencies of learners, they will be optimally nurtured if educational activities take place within an institutional environment in which democratically and interculturally appropriate and respectful structures and procedures permeate all aspects of institutional life. In other words, if a whole school approach is employed, and the competencies of learners will also be optimally nurtured if a cross-curricular approach is used, so that the responsibility for fostering the democratic competencies of learners is distributed across and shared by all teachers, irrespective of the specific school subject which they teach. We think the curricula should always be audited, reviewed, and developed to ensure that all 20 competencies are being fostered in learners. In order to identify students' learning needs, we think learning assessment based on the formative assessment based on the descriptors should be used, this formative assessment will then provide information about the specific areas that need to be targeted for further development in learners. Learning activity, having conducted your formative assessment, you can then design learning activities using the descriptors to help formulate the intended learning outcomes, which should be an advance on the existing level of proficiency of the individual learner. Because competencies, we think, are mobilized and deployed in dynamic clusters, these learning activities that are designed, should create opportunities for learners to master and to practice the behaviors that are associated with flexible combinations of descriptors that are drawn from several different competencies, rather than targeting just a single competence. In addition, these learning activities, we think they should be authentic learning activities. In other words, they should provide meaningful and relevant experiences for all learners. These learning activities, they should involve experiential learning, crucially, and learners should be encouraged to engage in observation, comparison, analysis, critical reflection, and action. And the optimal pedagogies to use are cooperative learning, project-based learning, and service learning for developing the competencies. And in addition, teachers also need to model democratic values and attitudes in the classroom, and they need to implement democratic processes in the classroom. There should also be plentiful opportunities for democratic participatory actions that are relevant to the lives of learners. In other words, authentic participatory actions, once again. There should also be plenty of opportunities for learners to have intercultural encounters and experiences. These can be face-to-face, or they could take place through the internet, or intercultural encounters can be experience through reflecting on representations of cultural differences in visual media, for example, on television, in comic books, for example, when you're talking about learners, or in movies, or in written texts as well. There should always be facilitation and encouragement of learners to engage in analysis and critical reflection on their democratic and intercultural experiences. Summative assessment should be used at the end of a period of learning. This should be based on the descriptors in order to identify which learning outcomes have or have not been achieved. And the results of summative assessments can then be used to identify further learning needs in learners, which can be targeted in the next cycle of learning. So in other words, the results of summative assessment can be used for formative purposes. You can take them to identify the next stage of learning that learners need to engage in. So those are the take-home messages. I'll end at this point. I'll just conclude by saying you can find out further information about the reference framework at this place on the web. This is the web link you'll need. There's a lot of information available there. You can also download freely the PDFs of the 3 volumes of the reference framework from that web link, which you can access from the competencies web link, from the simpler one up above. So I'll end just by saying thank you very much indeed for listening to this presentation, having the patience to listen to all of these words in what's been a fairly rapid whistle-stop tour through the reference framework. And I must end by acknowledging that the reference framework is a product of the work by the Council of Europe. Thank you very much indeed.
Esto tenemos habilitado interpretación.
Tienen que abrir el micrófono.
El micrófono.
Sí.
El tuyo.
Pero estaba. ¿Me oís? ¿Sí?
Ahora sí, gracias.
Okay. I'm sorry. So thank you very much, Martyn. La siguiente
Está silenciado Zoom. Tienen que habilitar el micrófono de Zoom.
¿Ahora? ¿Sí? Vale. Es que no está el mío. ¿Todos ahora? Sí. No, Tamara, apaga el audio del ordenador. ¿Ahora? Vale, perfecto, gracias. Problemas técnicos, esto es lo que pasa con webinars. Thank you, Martyn, for the 3rd time. I hope now everybody can hear me.
Perdón, no estamos escuchando. Tienen que dejar habilitado el Zoom de Tamar.
María, ¿por qué no hablamos de aquí?
Ahora sí la estamos escuchando. Pueden seguir. Gracias.
Vale. No sé. Por favor, tenemos habilitado interpretación. En Zoom, y para eso necesitáis utilizar el icono del Zoom. No puedo hacerlo así, lo siento.
Estamos escuchando bien, ¿eh?
¿Me oís ahora?
Sí, le confirmo que la estamos escuchando bien.
Vale, muchas gracias. Hopefully we can now start and everybody can hear. This part is going to work with both comments and questions that you may have for any of our panelists. Please write them in the chat. And I will try to moderate and distribute them to the right person. If there's a lot of questions, I'm not sure if we will be able to make it. We only have half an hour, so but it would be really good if you can just try to narrow down as much as possible the way you ask your question, and then maybe who you want or who is it directed to, even though I think depending on the topic everybody will then take turns. Now, I'm not sure again if everybody heard me. My name is Maria Tanaskova. I am the project manager of the Innotiv project that's implemented by the Universidad Católica de Valencia. So please feel free to use the chat to ask any questions or any comments in case you have for our panelists. And I think at this point, I will start just with a wider question on whether it's possible to maybe get more information or explain the specific role that developing values plays in the overall context of the Rfcdc framework. And I think probably all of our panelists can have something to say in this, but probably Martyn, if you could start, that would be great.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Developing values. So your question is, how do you develop values through education? How can teachers target
and the role them? Exactly? Yeah.
Yes, right. Okay, I mean, there is a lot of research in the social science literature on values and what you can and what you cannot do. One thing that we now know is that basically values are very central to people's self-concept, to the core of who they think they are. And for this reason, values can be very resistant to change. Therefore, for this reason, if you try directly to persuade somebody to change their values, this very often is not successful. People dig in, they defend their values, they feel that they themselves are under threat, and therefore this is not a successful strategy for trying to target particular values. What the research literature has actually shown is there are several ways that you can change people's values. One finding that is actually quite present in the research literature is the idea that if you make particular values very salient to individuals, you make them obvious, you draw their attention to these values, then basically this strengthens the importance of those values in an individual. You're not trying to persuade them, you're simply exposing them to the values. So basically, you can do this within the school. For example, you can set reading and writing activities for learners, just asking them to basically engage in some sort of exercise in which values are brought to the values that you want to encourage and promote are brought to their attention. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing that's been found in the research literature is if you get somebody to basically critically analyze and think about values and what a value and why that particular value is really important in very specific concrete circumstances. You get people to think about values. This strengthens value. This can be used to strengthen values as well. So of course, in the context of a school, there are instances every day within the school to which values can be relevant. So you can ask learners to reflect in those specific and concrete circumstances on the values and why they are important. So that's a second thing you can do. A third thing that we know from the research literature is that simply when somebody moves into an environment or enters a social group in which a particular value is very important or is part of the group self-definition, then as part of the process of adapting to life within that group, individuals internalize those values. It becomes part of their group identity. And by encouraging their identification with the group, this strengthens the internalization of the value. So in other words, the school is an ideal location, institution in which to do precisely this. It's an environment that children, that learners enter. Values can be placed at the center. This is what I mean by a whole school approach. The values can be placed at the center of how the school operates. Learners adapt to that environment. They identify with their schools. And this can be how values can be promoted through education, through the use of a whole school approach. So there are both instructional things that you can do within the classroom, encouraging learners to reflect critically on the importance of particular values, but there's also an institutional dimension to this, which you can also use to promote particular values in learners. So these methods, we know from the research literature, help to overcome the resistance that learners might have if you deliberately go out there and just try to persuade them that their values are wrong and these are the values that they should be following.
Okay, thank you very much, Martyn. Tamar, do you have something to add?
Yes, may I say something? From the perspective of our project, the Innova for Dev, probably what struck us in regarding to the reference framework of competence for democratic culture, because we did study and analyze other frameworks such as the UNESCO framework or the OECD, the global competence. Precisely what struck us is how this framework enhance and permits an approach which is based as well on value and fomenting and enhancing values, because of probably, if I may say, as I was not there in the conception of the framework, but for my understanding, the flexibility and the vivencial dimension which the framework provides teacher with working with. So the framework is easily adapted to the context. It does contemplate from the beginning the necessity of developing not only knowledge, skill, and attitude, but values. And it have dismantled what tends to be in a lot of framework an instrumentalizing dimension, because it's highly based on the contribution of resource and tools like critical pedagogy or other approaches that Martyn have highlighted in his presentation. So I would say that the fact that we have chosen this framework for specifically incorporate in teacher education is probably because of this high pedagogical value, and for the fact that it is so much aligned with the whole educational and philosophical approach of intercultural education, because intercultural education is conceived to be as part, it is part of, is a process. It is as much as in the process as in the end, and the educational end. Bearing in mind that what we are trying to do is to promote dialogue and a sense of belonging. And when we talk about education as a socializing agent, we have to remember that institutionally we do promote a series of concept, values, and we are in a position where we can potential certain attitudes. I think that in this sense, the Rfcdc is the most comprehensive and probably pedagogically wise, the most validated, to my humble opinion, resource in order to work on teachers' self-development of intercultural competences in order to proceed to their students' development of intercultural competences and democratic.
I'm not sure, Clara, if you have anything to add at this point.
Yes, thank you. In fact, this dimension has a very important impact on the project, on the Inno4D projects, where we are looking at how teachers can really get educated, trained to be able themselves to transmit those values to the students. So we are not here about teaching about a content topic like maths or which you can learn the content and transmit the content. We are talking about transmitting values where the teacher, as Martyn has said, plays a role model. So in fact, it has a big implication on teacher training in the sense that, as Tamar was saying, it implies a self-reflection of own attitudes, own values, stereotypes, prejudices, and also it requires an openness to reconsider own behavior and openness to change. So it requires maybe a new, in the terms that approach to training, and also it so far because so far, for example, the democratic value, which is maybe the most through the citizenship subject, which is incorporated in many of the country curricula, has been taught as mostly as a knowledge-based, as a knowledge subject. So it is not only a knowledge, but we need to ensure, teachers need to learn how to transmit the value to the democratic and dialogue value, democratic value to their students. It means also that the teachers need to acquire specific, not only this self-reflection about own attitudes and beliefs, but also acquire specific pedagogies, like Martyn was saying, about cooperative learning techniques that are essential for developing this respect to others and valuing and developing the democratic value. Experiential learning, meaning that promoting the opportunity to, during the initial or continuous professional development, having the opportunity to experience themselves in multicultural situations and learning new behaviors if needed. No, so it requires new approaches to education and techniques like learning how to manage conflict and so on. So the reference framework for competence for democratic culture is a huge and very valuable source of not only concepts, but also techniques and recommendations, which we believe for the project we need to still enrich, to adapt them, to also complement, so to say, for understanding which techniques can support teachers' own development and acquisition of not only re-questioning their values, but also techniques to teach that to their own students, which require different approaches than content-based subjects in this particular matter.
Thank you very much, Clara, for the insight. I will continue with a question from Javier Valle, who is a very good friend of the project. He and his team are working with us on some of the case studies that have contributed to the deliverable so far. And he actually has to leave in a few minutes, so I will kind of give a preferential treatment to his question. If you don't mind, I read the question in Spanish. I hope the interpreter can interpret, because I don't want to synthesize it in a way that we miss some of the part of the query. So, ¿cómo enlazar esta competencia? Aquí imagino estamos refiriéndonos a la competencia intercultural democrática con el nuevo marco competencial de la UE de 2018. Se ha establecido un nuevo marco para la nueva competencia 5 de la UE, personal, social y de aprender a aprender. Y existe una nueva competencia 6 de la UE referida al civismo. Entiendo que este marco se mueve entre estas dos competencias o se relaciona con alguna de ellas. I'm not sure if the interpretation got okay to Martyn. Yes, no? Okay, Clara, I think this is also yours. So
okay, and I wonder whether Clara would be the best person to address this, because Clara has an intimate working knowledge of all the EU frameworks.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I was just wondering if the interpretation bit worked.
Oh yes, I got the question.
Great.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara. The floor is yours.
Responderé a la pregunta en castellano, ya que la han hecho en castellano, esperando que la interpretación siga. Bien, es una pregunta que no tiene una respuesta muy clara, ¿vale? Vamos a empezar para los no expertos mencionando que tenemos una recomendación de las competencias clave para el aprendizaje permanente, que del 2018, que es una renovación de una del 2006, en la cual se proponen 8 competencias que incluyen la competencia de la ciudadanía, la competencia del otras competencias como por ejemplo las competencias digitales, las competencias del emprendimiento e incluye la competencia de competencias personales, sociales y aprender a aprender. Sabemos de entrada que las competencias no son totalmente aisladas y no hay una línea divisoria muy clara entre ellas. Por ejemplo, las competencias de emprendimiento tienen una gran componente digital para poder realizar y desarrollar esas competencias, por ejemplo. Igualmente, para poder desarrollar una ciudadanía activa, podemos imaginar que las competencias digitales son necesarias, sobre todo hoy en día, para poder movilizar, para poder recaudar fondos, para poder actuar, etc. Entonces, para empezar, diciendo que no hay una división clara y absoluta entre las competencias, pero sí que es una herramienta útil para enfocar un desarrollo competencial, para organizar la formación, los aprendizajes y la evaluación. Ahora una pequeña inciso institucional para aquellos que tampoco son duchos en la materia de las instituciones europeas. El Consejo de Europa es una institución en la cual no está directamente ligada a lo que se llama la Unión Europea de los 27 Estados miembros. La Unión Europea tiene competencias limitadas en educación, o sea, tiene limitadas, como expliqué antes, a lo que es el método abierto de coordinación, y en los cuales los Estados miembros trabajan en unas áreas, la cual incluye los valores europeos. En paralelo a la Unión Europea tenemos el Consejo de Europa, con 47 miembros, creo, si no me equivoco, que incluye más países, y esos Estados miembros se trabajan conjuntamente para el desarrollo del respeto de los derechos humanos, el rule of law, el Estado de Derecho y otro acercamiento. Y en particular trabaja sobre el ámbito de la educación como herramienta. Por ejemplo, un marco bien conocido de todos es el marco de los idiomas, de aprendizaje de los idiomas que conocemos en los niveles A1, A2, B1, B2, que ha sido desarrollado y implementado, desarrollado por el Consejo de Europa. Entonces nos encontramos aquí ante dos mundos que están trabajando en paralelo y en el cual hay oportunidades de colaborar. Es decir, el marco, la recomendación de la Unión Europea que incluye la ciudadanía y como una competencia particular relacionada, muy relacionada con la competencia democrática, y la otra competencia efectivamente del desarrollo personal, competencias sociales y aprendizaje a aprender, son dos competencias que, como hemos desarrollado en nuestro primer informe público, están conectadas con este marco del Consejo de Europa, el marco de referencia para las competencias de la cultura democrática. Entonces, ¿cómo acercarlos? La recomendación del Consejo de las competencias clave para el aprendizaje permanente de la Comisión de la Unión Europea recomienda utilizar los trabajos del Consejo de Europa para las competencias, en particular la competencia de la ciudadanía. Como investigadora, y no en nombre de la Comisión, me gustaría decir que espero que la Comisión, que el marco del Consejo de Europa sea una herramienta promovida y utilizada lo más posible dentro del ámbito de los trabajos de la Comisión, sobre todo porque está basado en un trabajo de larga duración, de por lo menos 10 años de trabajo, comenzando por el diálogo intercultural y las competencias democráticas, con un gran apoyo de investigación científica y un gran trabajo de consenso, que es parte de los procesos que a nivel de la Unión Europea también trabajamos. Es decir, hace falta que no sea solo un marco científicamente válido, sino que los Estados miembros y los diferentes actores lo reciban y lo aprueben como un marco válido que contemple las realidades, la gran diversidad de las realidades de los diferentes Estados miembros. Mi opinión como investigadora es que este marco cumple con las condiciones que la Comisión Europea necesita para digamos, adoptar un marco porque está realizado según los procesos similares que utiliza la Comisión para estos marcos, con lo cual espero que haya un acercamiento. Por ejemplo, podríamos imaginar que para la competencia de ciudadanía se utilizara este marco como un marco base de referencia, ya que todavía la Comisión Europea no ha desarrollado marco, sino que la recomendación del Consejo recomienda utilizar al máximo los trabajos del Consejo de Europa. Por ejemplo, hemos desarrollado marcos de competencias desde JRC, en particular para las competencias digitales, para las competencias de emprendimiento y para las competencias de desarrollo de competencias personales, sociales y aprendizaje y aprender a aprender. Mi visión como investigadora y esperando que, bueno, que podamos sobre todo reunir esfuerzos y reutilizar trabajos realizados para ser lo más eficaces posibles en lo que es el apoyo al desarrollo de esta competencia, que es el objetivo último que estamos intentando construir. Es que las competencias de cultura democrática y que incluye la interculturalidad se desarrollen al nivel de los profesores y a los ciudadanos, por consiguiente, pues de manera eficaz y bueno, lo más rápidamente posible en el contexto que vivimos hoy en día, en el cual la diversidad es un dato, es una realidad que no hace más que aumentar. Así que, bueno, espero haber contestado, aunque sea de manera imprecisa, pero es un contexto políticamente, que tiene componente política que no depende de nosotros como investigadores.
Thank you very much, Clara, for giving us this wider and broader idea of the EU part of this competence development and the policies and also institutions involved. And furthermore, Javier is extremely grateful for everything and laments the fact that there can't be a in-presence dialogue to have a more fluid exchange. But thank you very much for covering all these issues. We have a question from Leslie Bash. He is another valued part of the InnoForDev project. And this one goes out to Martyn. Thank you for an extremely informative presentation. My question is, how can democratic and intercultural competences be acquired in a global political climate increasingly unconducive to fundamental democratic norms and values? And then furthermore, as a social studies educator, I was engaging with similar issues in the 70s when the macro-political climate seemed to be developing in a more positive direction. Today, the challenges seem much more formidable for educators and policymakers. How can we meet these challenges? So again, to Martyn, and then I'm assuming Tamar and Clara might also have comments on this. Thank you, Leslie.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. Wow, what a question. I mean, this is something I think that we could sit here and talk about for the next couple of hours, actually, and I'd love to have a face-to-face dialogue with you about these issues. But unfortunately, the medium that we're with doesn't allow all of this. I can't comment so much back on the 1970s, but I can give you my perception of things as they currently stand. And they are like this. I think part of the problem that we've got this political climate unconducive to democratic norms and values. We are there because of a failure of citizenship education on a large scale. At the time that present sort of adult voters were at school. And, you know, I know the situation most thoroughly, of course, within the UK, but we have the Eurydice studies of other European countries as well. And the picture of citizenship education from the past has not been very good. So I think we have adult populations that have grown up without knowing how to critically evaluate the information that they are given by politicians. They do not have many of the competences that we are saying that learners should be equipped with. And I think we're living partly with the consequences of that. So from my point of view, this actually really underlines the importance of education based on the reference framework. This is desperately what we need, precisely because of this political climate that we're living with today. This is precisely why this kind of education, and by that I mean in the old Council of Europe terminology, why we desperately need human rights education so that people know what human rights are and why they're so crucial and critical for so many aspects of our contemporary societies. It's why we need education for democratic citizenship, so that we actually have learners being educated to take up the norms of democratic citizenship, the norms and values, and why we need intercultural education to enhance the intercultural competences of young people so that they can appreciate and understand and engage in dialogue with people across the so-called sort of cultural boundaries, across with people who have different cultural affiliations from themselves. So it's actually what we're living with now in so many countries in the world shows how radically important this kind of education actually is. And in a sense, the situation isn't entirely bleak, because basically the reference framework, it was being developed at a time of major terrorist attacks in Europe, when the Charlie Hebdo attacks occurred in Paris, and we held a conference of the education ministers in Brussels a few weeks after the devastating Brussels terrorist attacks, and that sort of set the tone for that conference of the education ministers. And at that particular conference, the reference framework in its early stages was presented to the education ministers, and unanimously the education ministers, this is education ministers of the Council of Europe member states, so that is the 47 member states, they all unanimously endorsed the reference framework and said this is exactly what we need to deal with these situations that we have escalating within our own countries at the moment. Now, one knows that there are some countries that are actually in practice going to be less inclined to implement education based on the reference framework than other countries. But the Council of Europe ran a survey of the member states 1 year after the reference framework had been published, so just 1 year later, and we found in that survey that the framework was already at that point being implemented in 17 member states in one way or another. So within 1 year of publication of the final framework, you know, education ministers were putting their money where their mouths were. They had signed this declaration endorsing the framework, and 17 of them were in the process already of implementing it. And that gives me some sort of hope that there is a significant number of countries recognizing the importance of this kind of education precisely to deal with the terrible challenges that we're facing in so many countries at the present time. So anyway, there's far, far more that we could talk about on this, but I'll pass over to my fellow panelists because I'm sure they have something to say about this issue as well.
Thank you very much, Martyn, for giving us this real feel of the purpose and the utility of the Rfcdc, and also how it actually feels a gap that came out of a real need. Clara, I'm sure you have something to say on this.
Well, it's a personal opinion, but I think one of the great things of the reference framework, or of any reference framework, but now that we have this Council of Europe reference framework for competence for democratic culture, is that it allows to cut the cake into little pieces. So to eat elephant in little pieces. So it gives opportunities for applying in the classroom and on teachers' education, different aspects, different knowledge or skills or attitudes on different how to say, types of activities. If there is, for example, possibility for experiential learning in the link, having, for example, contribution to the community challenges and the local community challenges, having the possibility to learn to dialogue. So developing pieces of the competence framework can be conducive to building at the end some so to say, students which have developed a kind of active citizenship competence and some sense of democratic culture. Collaborative learning as well is a technique that on its own gives a lot of benefits, but among others also teaches how to respect each other, how to appreciate the others, and appreciate the difference and the complementarity of a group, develops the dialogue among different perspectives and consensus building processes. All of these activities, even if they are not called democratic competence on their own, are techniques that can be developed and applied in the classroom and allow to develop these little building blocks that the framework talks us about, that at the end overall, if not all the 20 competences can be developed because in particular a country or environment is not very conducive or very supportive for it, at least I think that little pieces can be developed and so far somehow move towards a more democratic citizenship individuals all over Europe. And hopefully the 47 member states, which is I think great information from Martyn and encouraging to know that there is really a national will across a number of countries to move towards this direction and to engage into education processes towards building this culture, which is democratic culture, so much needed in my own opinion to nowadays.
I would like to try being respectful with the time limits that we have. I just can't resist because I think this issue is really very relevant to our Innovative project. And I would like just to highlight one dimension that led us to the selection of this framework. And just letting to you know, all of you, that this is only the first webinar in a series of different ones. So I hope we would be able to take all those questions that were not addressed here and continue in the next meeting. But coming back to what Martyn was mentioning regarding the citizenship education, I just want to recall that the document, the policy document that inspires actually the need for elaborating this research is the Paris Declaration, which identifies the need to provide teachers with tools in order to foster a sense of belonging among citizenship. So Martyn was talking about citizenship education. I'm afraid that so far, not in all countries, but in many countries, citizenship education and basically or mainly the concept of EU citizenship was not addressed from an approach that really foster a sense of belonging, or not the practice of the citizenship, but merely instrumental, descriptive dimension. It was mainly, or it is a lot of times delivered through textbook, but there's not really a vivencial dimension of what this participation or citizenship represents to the individual. So once again, so we're coming to the need to foster and to provide teacher with this capacity of working with students through participatory approaches and pedagogical resources that would enable them to construct within themselves this sense of belonging and foster a sense of European identity around those shared values which depart from the whole notion of human dignity and acknowledgement of pluralism. So I think that in spite of circumstances, we're definitely on the right track, and probably the contribution of the Rfcdc is the fact that it enables us all in the education field, and mainly teachers, educators, establish a shared language and follow those descriptors and reduce probably the burden that's opposed to a teacher having to provide those sources that eventually would enable developing values and attitudes. So we are aparting from this, I would say, superficial approach of educating towards citizenship, and if I may, intercultural citizenship, and focusing on what makes all of us, and firstly teaches intercultural competence.
Thank you, Tamar. This is all the time we have for the questions and answers. I just wanted to, rather in a more of a wrap-up mode, if any of our speakers feel the need to say something more that they feel it's a must in terms of sharing it with our audience. So let's say a couple of minutes each, if you wish. And then I guess we will just wrap up and end our discussion. So should we go again, Martyn?
Okay, thank you. Well, I would first of all really like to thank the Catholic University of Valencia for hosting this event, which I think is incredibly important. And I'm really glad and thankful to you, Tamar, in particular, for giving us a platform to basically, okay, partly it's to disseminate the reference framework, but actually it's more targeted than that, because I'm assuming many people in the audience here are actually people who are currently trainee teachers and are going to be the teachers of the future, or are teachers already practicing teachers who are taking some sort of in-service training. And actually, I think it's the teachers are the most crucial agents in all of this. They are the people we need to address our messages to, because, you know, we can sit in international institutions like the Council of Europe and the European Commission and speak till we're blue in the face, but actually what we need are the teachers in the schools working with the children, implementing these education based on these sorts of principles and values above all else. And they are the ones who are actually going to introduce the changes that Leslie was talking about, it, you know, in his question, that were implicit in his question there that he put to us before. So I would really just like to thank the teachers as well who are here, either present teachers or future teachers. You are our future. You are the future of European societies. So please do your work with hope and in your hearts that you are going to achieve some very real changes in the societies that we're living in at the moment. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Martyn. Clara?
Thank you. Well, first, also thank the Catholic University of Valencia and now the European Institute for Education of Competence, Democratic Competence Culture, for organizing this and allowing us, I hope, an ongoing platform for continue our discussion, because this is work in process, for all of us. So I hope that we will be able to continue discussing and sharing the results and exchanging about them. And also linking to what Martyn says, I deeply believe that the key person here in this topic is the teacher. And this is why Inno4Div has been designed in that sense, so to understand what can be done at policy level to support teachers in this endeavor. So the outputs aim at both supporting policies that support teachers, but also providing material that aims at being inspiring and supportive to the teachers' tasks. So thank you all for, also thanking the audience for being there, participating and asking questions.
Tamar?
What can I say? Whenever I listen to you, Martyn or Clara, I feel very inspired and overwhelmed, and I feel a lot of satisfaction. I would like to thank you both for your valuable contribution, not only for this webinar, but for the mere existence of this institute. I have to say that the creation of the institute has been highly promoted by the fact that all of us as researchers become much more involved in those questions of the need to developing competence framework and provide policymakers, but both teachers, with the opportunity to discuss, to dialogue, and to take forward this mission of the development of these competence. I have to say that for us, it has been decisive, the fact that the JRC and Clara Centeno played in the sense that she enabled us to approach an issue we were working already from 2015, but suddenly got a further dimension, looking at things from perspective of stakeholders and understanding the need of providing evidence-based, of creating evidence-based policy. And to Martyn, I can't say enough how grateful I am for sharing his knowledge, for supporting us, for accompanying us in a process of development, of growth, both professionally and definitely personally. I do hope this webinar will be the beginning of other opportunity of exchange. I would like to thank as well those pre-service teachers, students who are sharing with us this webinar. For us, it's a privilege. And just as both Clara and Martyn said, for us, the fact that teachers in service, as much as pre-service teachers are sharing this, is the fact that gives sense of all of this work we're trying to pursue together. And just a minor issue regarding practical, just to let you know all that this is happening with accordance to the COVID proficiencies. So we have here gels and we maintain the distance, and that's why we don't wear this. But thanks so much for taking the time for this in such complicated circumstances. Hopefully this would lead to further collaboration. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much, everybody. To our speakers that for their insights, and I think this has given a lot of food for thought, especially for those future teachers. As Tamar said, we have full classes listening in on this webinar. And then again, I would like to thank the people behind the webinar. So all the people behind the scenes that you haven't been able to see helped us with all the technical and issues and the registration. And
a special thanks to Esther from the O3, who spent hours and hours assuring this would work, to Adela, our interpreter, and to Lorenzo, the technical support, and obviously Samuel, who accompanied us along the whole process.
So thank you very much for all of this. We really hope you found this event useful. We look forward to organizing something further along, hopefully next year. But then again, maybe things will just settle down and we can do this in person, and this dialogue will be much more fluent. I won't have to read out questions.
Thank you very much as well, Celia Martinez, which is doing a wonderful job. Thank you, Maria. And we now finish our webinar. Thank you very much all. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.